Welcome, I'm Professor Spring, and today we'll discuss philosophy during the 3 centuries of Greek history leading up to its conquest by Rome. I love this era of philosophy because it's grounded in the concerns of everyday individuals, how we can be our best and do our best as citizens on this planet. A lot of philosophy can feel inscrutable to newcomers or simply too high-minded and cosmic to feel applicable to ordinary life. It sometimes gets too convoluted to hold up well or too directed at a privileged audience. If you're not a prince or a fledgling warlord, there are plenty of philosophical treatises that might not speak to your concerns. But Hellenistic philosophy still feels relevant and accessible today because it's as handy as it is elegant. So I hope you'll enjoy my very general remarks on the topic. If you're new to these ideas and want to learn more, I'll include recommended reading in the comments. And feel free to subscribe for part 2, coming soon to a tube near you. So we'll be discussing the dominant schools of Greek philosophy in this era, those being Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Skepticism. These schools built upon, splintered from, and flourished into new traditions, but we'll be focusing on these 3 primarily. It's also important to understand that while these schools were founded by Greeks, many of the thinkers who popularized and advanced them were Romans, so that can get a little bit confusing. And obviously they had all different waves of popularity and revivals throughout history. But today we'll mostly discuss the origins of these schools of philosophy. And I've included a bit of book flip B-roll to provide some visual context and cozy book sounds throughout. I hope it adds a soothing layer of relaxation. So with all that said, let's get started. Incited by the death of Alexander the Great of Macedonia in 323 BC, the Hellenistic age, now so well understood as a great leap forward for Western philosophy, began as a period of greater uncertainty. Leaving behind an empire sprawling as far as India without a clear line of succession, Alexander unwittingly paved the way for major shifts in the philosophical framing of a new world order. And while his strongest generals sought to divide and rule these conquered lands, more academic parties set to ordering hearts and minds in far more enduring ways. The geographical borders of the age no longer stand. The paradigms of philosophy remain. Between Alexander's death in 323 BC and the rise of Augustus of Rome in 31 BCE, empires would rise and fortunes reverse, and today we tell those tales as ancient history. But the philosophies born of this nebulous era still inspire and dominate modern thought, psychology, and even self-help spheres in ways that improbably feel both contemporary and timeless. It was in this era that a truly cosmopolitan cultural exchange emerged, with great philosophical minds contemplating the role of leaders and leadership rather than the shape of a homogeneous Greek society. And that shift from collective to individual would bridge the ideals of Aristotle and Plato to the more personal mandates of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Hellenism takes its meaning from the Greek word for, well, Greek, Hellene, Hellene. But we can understand it historically as an era when it became more and more essential to define just what it meant to be Greek. Because suddenly there was a bigger, richer world of influence, especially with the conquest of South Asia and other far-flung lands, providing both inspiration, and contrast to Greek custom. So this then becomes fundamentally an exploration of continuity and novelty in Western thought. I'd like to note that words like Stoic, skeptical, and Epicurean have all become nuanced adjectives within the modern English tongue. Add to that the rise of popular Stoicism or modern agnostic Stoicism. You can see guys like Ryan Holiday, Tim Ferriss, any number of grind-set Stoic bros on Insta. And honestly, a lot of the most effective cognitive behavioral therapists out there, CBT is largely founded on Stoic tenets and can be really helpful to a lot of people. And it becomes more necessary to tread cautiously here. That's not to say that these modern understandings don't have value, but they can limit our assessment of classical philosophy if we're not careful. So in lieu of plumbing the depths of these distinctions, I'll just point out that you can often distinguish these general differences through context and convention. It's easy enough to denote that classical philosophies receive capital letters, so that small s Stoic may mean unencumbered by emotion, while capital S Stoic refers to a sage or student, also known as Procopton of the formal school. So small s for Garfield's Stoic owner John Arbuckle, big S for Seneca the Stoic. Two big S's actually, Seneca and Stoic. You might have a generally skeptical temperament, but that's not exactly the same as practicing big S skepticism. Capiche? So all of these philosophies loom large in modern thought and all have helpful and more deleterious applications. In lightheartedly calling out distinctions, I hope you'll understand I find immense value in many of the modern Hellenistic applications, and admittedly, I find fault and shortcomings in others. The Stoic idea of God was far from most modern mainstream ones, and we'll briefly discuss their concept of God as universe later on. But a strong fatalistic universe is the bedrock on which the rest was built. And while I do believe that many can benefit from modern Stoic practices, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I'll go on record as saying I see modern Stoicism as a bastardization of its classical precedent. Still, as someone who both understands Americanos to be bastardizations of American drip coffee and really still prefers Americanos, I don't say these as warring words, not trying to start a fight. The benefit of secularization is also a wealth of appeal and application that really can't be understated. Religion can seem alienating, especially in the realms of formal academia and psychology, but the fact remains pop Stoicism just isn't classical Stoicism. It's more attitude than philosophy, and I still don't want it with cream and sugar. Simply put, though, it's harder to put your trust in fate without a deep underlying faith in the design of that fate. This fundamental evolution is more popular and palatable for contemporary audiences, but undermines some of the clarity and elegance of the Stoic worldview, in my opinion. Does that all sound like Greek to you? That's probably because I'm only a pretend professor and I've gotten ahead of myself. So let's break it down from the top here, okay? And please remember, you may take umbrage with my simplifications and definitions here. However, I'll do my best to keep the generalizations throughout to be thoughtful and accurate. So, there are three major schools of Hellenistic philosophy, as we talked about. The most popular school, then and now, is Stoicism. I'm sure you've heard of it, if not about it. Stoics sought freedom from suffering through virtue and adherence to the will of the universe. Submit to the will of that universe, and you can always trust that things are the way they ought to be. That way, if anything feels out of your control, you can say, that does not concern me. All I can control are my own reactions, the thoughts I assent to, and the things that I do with my own mind and body. The most fun school, then and now, is Epicureanism. Not Epicurusism, that's just for recipes. Epicureans sought freedom from suffering through sustainable pleasure. And I think sustainable does some really heavy lifting here, as these guys get a pretty bad rap for being party animals. And sure, they like to party, some of them, but it's mindful, it's demure, it's all in moderation. And rounding things out, we have the most contrarian, the most punk rock, the skeptics. Skeptics sought freedom from suffering via liberation from dogma. And yeah, that's a subtweet. Skeptics were really dialectical to the other schools and largely sought to serve up antithesis before answers. But what's godliness and goodness without those gadflies, right? Maybe you affiliate with or lean toward one school more than another. As we go along, I'd love for you to tell me about which school of philosophy you feel most inspired by or most aligns with your own goals and virtues. But hold up. Zach Moore's time out. How exactly do we get from those early Greek philosophers, so sagacious and pure, to these self-centered renegades of new? You see, Plato, Aristotle, and friends were chiefly concerned with idealism. A simplification to be sure, but perhaps an expedient way of conceptualizing the more high-minded focus of their age with the more practical and prescriptive mandates of their successors. Because in an exponentially expanding empire, it was no longer enough to ask who to be and in whose image. With great strides in territorial expansion, mobility, and trade, questions of emotion, perception, perspective, and self were becoming paramount. How to act and why meant more in a diverse world, and distinguishing oneself in society meant more in times of uncertain rule, with the potential for ascension. And really in the potential for division and differentiation. The greater whole was, quite suddenly, not the whole picture. And if the map could expand, so could personal ambition and attainment. It's a lot to digest. I could use another Americano. Luckily, a mad lad and ancient academic named Xenocrates, or Xenocrates, if you're Bill and Ted, prescribed 3 divisions of philosophy that I find very helpful. We can understand philosophy through physics, through logic, and through ethics. Now, classical Stoics followed these divisions pretty meticulously, but early Epicureans tend to issue the term logic and favor canonic, roughly the scientific method and sense perception, as the premier way of knowing. However, later Epicureans returned to the term logic to conform to these more standardized headings, and it's simpler that way, but if you hear them interchangeably, that's why. All of the skeptics, whom we'll eventually discuss in terms of 2 major schools, differed in that they did not advance nor codify their own doctrines, though they did use this tripartite division in refuting the dogmatists, or those who held definite beliefs, so the Epicureans, the Stoics, etc., etc., etc. The skeptics are like contrarians, except way more fun at Thanksgiving dinner. but a lot of what they add here is counterpoint. So it's necessary to establish prevalent mainstream thought before their very valid criticisms of said thought. So for the record, I do have as much love for the skeptics as the others. They're the shadowy bad boys to my natural hall monitor energy. I don't want to erase anyone. They just function a little bit differently than the Epicureans and Stoics, who were sort of competing schools. So let's talk about the physics of it all. Modern casual listeners can probably anticipate how logic and ethics function within a philosophical context, but the inclusion of physics may seem less intuitive. Sorry, books. Physics. They responded to my touch. These physics helped explain the very nature of matter and the role of reason in human life. So while the Stoics believed in universe almost as deity, a single whole made of matter and reason, Epicureans imagined a more dualistic model of atoms and void. Atoms and void. Sounds pretty cool. And while the Stoics believed in a deep, indelible purpose to the universe, the Epicureans saw existence as chaotic and largely accidental. Stoics perceived a logically developed underlying fate to things, fatalism, where Epicureans believed in some determinism. Individual atoms might move with order or purpose, for example, but no wholly interwoven fate or design to all things in their mind. There are a couple isms that I find really useful in understanding these physics. So firstly, materialism, right? Materialism. And not the kind of materialism that means I'll never ever play as many games on Steam as I own on Steam. No, those even bigger questions of matter. What is it? Why is it? Can I put more pumpkin spice in it? In general, the Hellenists departed from discussions of the incorporeal in favor of the material. And this was a major departure from predecessors like Aristotle, who so deeply considered God, or what he called the unmoved mover, in his works. Again, those very high-minded cosmic concerns. Epicureans honored the existence of the immaterial void, but considered it alongside material atoms. In their own physics, Stoics maintained time, place, void, and lecta, meanings or things said. Lecta. So lecta. Hannibal lecta. That's funny. To me. Only to me. However, the Stoics were adamant that only corporeal things exist, while incorporeals simply subsist. So their void surrounded the cosmos, but did not affect it. This distinction in metaphysics is exceedingly complicated and controversial and really necessitates its own deep dive. Some consider these just linguistic quibbles, and some say they're the heart of Stoic metaphysics. It's something else I'd really love to do an entire video on someday, but for now, let's move on to the other essential ism, and that is empiricism. I think this is important, the theory that we gain knowledge through sensory experience. You could call it the opposite of rationalism, but I prefer to think of them as frenemies. They'd at least have cute babies, I think. While not an entirely novel idea, empiricism became significantly more vigorous and self-assured in the hands of the Hellenists. Aristotle particularly saw limitations in empiricism and favored more inductive crucibles to render concepts certain. In other words, knowing through one's own senses was a fine way of knowing, but not a sole way of knowing. Interestingly, this thoroughgoing dedication to empirical concept formation was exactly the kind of thing that irked the Hellenistic skeptics. But the Epicureans were all about it. Empiricism was really at the heart of everything they believed. Now, to the skeptics, this dedication to a single foundation of knowing smacked of nothing more than dogma dabbling. But let's move on to logic. So, the understanding and application of empiricism actually helps bridge a physical understanding of the universe with a more logical one. Given that Epicureans did not hold with God or religion in particular, it's tempting to assume they were more concerned with logic than their universe as God-revering rivals, the Stoics. Famously, Epicurus used logical dilemma or paradox to refute the concept of a God concerned with human affairs. He didn't wholesale reject the idea of a God, just one that was interested in what we were doing. But as much as he built upon foundations of knowledge and logic, he rejected the Platonic reliance on reason as a way of knowing. And the Stoics were themselves avid logicians, folding debate, rhetoric, grammar, and epistemology into their overall understanding of logic. Arguably, their scope of logic was much broader, but in many ways, the Epicurean approach was cleaner and more readily digested. Concerning ethics, we can observe a consistent through line from pre-philosophy, then voiced by Plato and Aristotle, and eventually upheld by the Hellenists. In all of Greek life, accordance with nature of man and nature of universe, were perceived as paramount to a good life. And to being a good person, I think it's safe to say. Just listen to Marcus Aurelius, noted Stoic emperor and universe stan. He said, "Everything harmonizes with me, which is harmonious to thee, O universe. Nothing for me is too early or too late, which is in due time for thee." He also said, "He who lives in harmony with himself lives in harmony with the universe." Marcus Aurelius, universe wife guy. But this reverence of capital N nature is one of the clearest continuities between philosophical eras, and it was the work of both Stoics and Epicureans to fortify and expand these beliefs. To be in accordance with nature was to honor the excellence of the soul, and no purpose could be higher to philosophers contemplating the role of self in our world. However, there are distinctions and progressions in the ethical considerations of the Hellenists, particularly in the realm of spirituality. So one such distinction regards Plato's civil war of the soul, the ongoing strife between reason and a higher spiritual autonomy. Conversely, the Stoics believed that the entirety of the soul was governed by reason. Therefore, mankind could rise and fall by virtue of reason alone, and every person might therefore achieve natural harmony. For their part, the Epicureans believed the soul to be governed by the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. Like human bodies, human souls developed and acted on sensations and perceptions. That pure faith again in empiricism. And then the skeptics, they just didn't really buy the whole concept of a soul to begin with. What am I gonna do with a soul anyway? Souls are boring, as a great man once said. But here's the deal with the skeptics in general. Again, skeptic beliefs can't really be classified or generalized simply. They aren't purely antithetical or adversarial thinkers, but we can understand them best through what they oppose. So their work was to question certainly held beliefs, not calcify them. As I mentioned, we can talk about the Hellenistic skeptics in two major schools. So academic and Pyrrhonist. That's Pyrrrhonist, Pyrrhonist. Academic skeptics were led by Arcesilaus, and they held Socrates in very high esteem. Their goals were refutation, cross-examination, and the pursuit of intellectual integrity. They sought to suspend judgment of all truths. Academic skeptics exercised their convictions and understandings solely through oral debate. See, the written word was antithetical to the dialectical purity of skeptical virtue. So the simple act of writing a thing down could become an act of fossilization, rendering thoughts more permanent and potentially more didactic, which could then lead to them becoming enshrined as dogma, if that makes sense. Now, the Pyrrhonian school originates with Anicedemus through the obscure Pyrrho of Elis, and he was chosen as the school's spiritual founder and namesake. Having lived centuries prior to the founding of formal skepticism and written no personal musings down to pass on, Pyrrho might seem an odd choice of mascot. It seems to me likely that he was chosen for his enigmatic qualities, though, allowing the school's adherents to myth make and shape his image to their own needs. The Pyrrhonists had an ethical goal that exceeded cross-examination for its own sake, like the academics. Freedom from disturbance, a variation upon the freedoms sought by Stoics and Epicureans, was an express purpose that sought intellectual liberation from dogmatic certainties and commitments. They sought the ability to balance opposing views without tension, and the ability to hold opposing beliefs with serenity is certainly a virtue I think is worth pursuing. It strikes me as one of the Hellenistic projects that feels so resonant in modern life. I think maybe especially on the internet, right? The later Pyrrhonists actually criticized academic skeptics for actually claiming to know too much, essentially gatekeeping those who came before them. Have you ever heard anyone say that something isn't ASMR because it's not whispering? No, me neither. That kind of thing doesn't happen. Unrelated. Anyway, their larger point was that really nothing can be known, and the best we can hope for is to understand the nature of probability. Certainly some things are more likely than others. And while I've mentioned the schism between modern and classical Stoicism, ancient Stoics and Epicureans were more typically in sync. They didn't splinter off so much. Certainly one philosopher or practitioner might develop and refine certain tenets, but these ideas usually harmonized with their founders. I want to talk a little bit about who these founders and philosophers were. So I want to start by talking about the founders of each school. Epicurus, the founder of Epicureanism, you may have guessed, lived the fairly typical life of an Athenian citizen. Born at the tail end of the classical Greek period, he likely received broad Platonic training in academics, and we know he served in the military. Epicurus studied under great tutors and revered thinkers like Pyrrho and the cynic Diogenes. He was great, but ultimately claimed his ideas as solely his own. He was regarded as pious and congenial and said to have lived quite frugally, subsisting on mostly bread and water. This could also be great PR, with a man going hog on figs like a hobbit at Elevensies who really knows. He did say, "Send me a little pot of cheese so that I can indulge that extravagance when I wish." Epicurus, the man, the myth, the cheesemonger. Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium, and like Epicurus, he's said to have lived a simple, even aesthetic life, despite being a noted and wealthy merchant. Zeno studied under excellent tutors as well, and eventually began teaching in the colonnade in the Agora of Athens, known as the Stoa Poikile. Known at first as Zenonians, his disciples eventually came to be known as Stoics. And if you don't know what a Stoa is, it's sort of like a portico. If you think of an outdoor Greek building that might have a bit of an awning to shade you from the sun, the rain, the wind, just the elements, that was known as a stoa. And these were places where poets, philosophers, great thinkers, and I don't know, maybe influencers who wanted some attention would walk back and forth to think, to contemplate, to refine their ideas, and sometimes to teach and to talk. And it's said that people would come to listen to Zeno at the Stoa, walking back and forth and spouting off his wondrous ideas. That's the dream for all of us, right? We just go on and on and on and on, and people listen and think we're smart. Like and subscribe. I'm just kidding. I mean, please feel free. Known at first as Zenonians, his disciples eventually became known as Stoics, like Stoa. Perhaps this is why Zeno is often less remembered and revered among other Stoic philosophers. If only he had had Epicurus' PR team. But here's why Zeno really shouldn't be forgotten. He has the best origin story. And he founded the most popular and enduring school of ancient philosophy known to the Western world. But the story's good. According to the story, Zeno goes to the Oracle of Delphi, a revered priestess of Apollo who can, allegedly for legal purposes, talk to the gods. And Zeno asks what to do with his life. And you know what the oracle replies? "You must take on the complexion of the dead." It would be so cool to have oracles today. I imagine a timeline in which an oracle said the same thing to Susie Sue and Robert Smith. But Zeno was much smarter than I, and he did not interpret this as a call to go goth. He believed it meant he should take on the thoughts and ideas of those great thinkers before him. And in many ways, we take on the complexion of the dead when we study him today. I also really like Zeno because he's said to have been as cantankerous as Epicurus was affable. So I've also heard him described as gloomy, maintaining a small social circle, constantly harried by rain clouds. The thinking man's Eeyore. I wonder if he ever lost his tail. It's also said that he died after tripping publicly and breaking his toe. So we concentrate on the origin and not the me IRL ending. Speaking of endings, we've talked about quite a bit today. And as usual, I've still got loads more to say. So I'm going to give this class of philosophers a small reset. Seek respite, seek reflection, seek potted cheeses. Because in part 2, we're going to compare and contrast the people and principles of Hellenistic philosophy and examine how you can apply these ideas to your own life, which I hope will be helpful. I do so hope you'll join me. Feel free to subscribe so you don't miss the next installment, but only if that feels in accordance with your nature. Otherwise, I hope this was relaxing, enjoyable, and hopefully edifying. As always, it's my pleasure entirely, and I'm so thankful for you. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you soon. As a little bonus, I'm just gonna do a little bit of ear to ear of some of my favorite words in this little talk. So I think lecta is such a nice word. Lecta, 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 lecta. And I like Epictetus, Epictetus, because of that nice, like, epic, it's kind of pleasant. It has like a nice, and Seneca kind of does the same thing. Seneca. Platonic is a little bit better. Platonic. Arcesilaus.